Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the icy boots of medieval peasants, facing down the kind of cold that would make your freezer look like a sauna. No fancy heating, no cozy pajamas, just a thin straw mattress and a prayer. Imagine crawling into a tiny, drafty hut, your fingers numb, hoping that the meager fire keeps its flame alive just long enough to stop your toes from turning blue. Spoiler alert, surviving those brutal winter nights was a different kind of survival test, not exactly what you'd call a Netflix binge. So, before we dive into the frostbite and famine, hit that like button if you love. As the first frost settled quietly over the 13th century hamlet, Aldrich, a weathered but gentle farmer, watched his modest thatched cottage haze with smoke curling slowly into the chilly air. His young daughter Alin sat by the flickering hearth, her hands wrapped around a small cup of mead, her eyes tracking the shifting shadows outside. The villagers, gathered in the center of the hollow, seemed momentarily hushed by the biting cold, their faces blurred with the soft glow of lanterns and early twilight. They were simple people, accustomed to the silent promise of winter, yet each felt the weight of the coming nights in their bones. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and stale straw, both as familiar as the stories they would tell to pass the long, cold hours ahead. With the cold deepening, the small community began to brace themselves, stacking firewood in uneven piles and sealing shutters against the dark chill. Aldrich's daughter clutched her cloak tighter as the wind tugged at the thatch, whispering of colder nights to come. Inside their home, rough-hewn benches and a shared loaf of bread seemed both humble and enough, a fragile barrier against the relentless winter. Outside, neighbors exchanged cautious nods, their breath puffing like fleeting clouds, each occupied with the small, necessary rituals of survival. The earth seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the icy grip to tighten, a silent reminder that winter's true test had now begun. It was almost ironical how, as the cold grew harsher, the village's stories of past winters became something of a quiet comedy, retold with a dry, almost amused tone. Tales of frozen wells that mocked the village's efforts, or cattle lost in a mists of white, were recounted with a shrug, a shared acceptance of winter's unpredictable humor. The faces, blurred by the flickering shadows, held a slight smile, an acknowledgement that no amount of preparation could fully tame nature's indifference. Elderly villagers, with a tired sort of wisdom, would joke about the length of winter and the inescapable march of cold, their voices barely audible over the crackling fire. In these small, ironic exchanges, there was a strange comfort, an understanding that perseverance was merely a matter of patience and tepid humor. As the night cloaked the village in darkness, the small cottages settled into a rare stillness, each family cocooned in their silent routines. The warm glow from hearths bathed the rooms in a gentle amber, softening the worn faces of those within. Aldrich's family, like many others, moved slowly, their motions deliberate, tending the fire, adjusting blankets, listening quietly to the wind's faint moan against the thatch. There was a muted dignity in these ordinary acts, a shared patience that made the cold feel somehow less imposing. Outside, the stars blinked faintly through the sparse gaps in thatched roofs, tiny pinpricks amid the vast, unmoving night, whispering in silence that this, too, was part of life's steady, if sluggish, flow. In moments of quiet reflection, the villagers understood that survival was less about grand resilience and more about the gentle, enduring rhythm of everyday life. Aldrich, looking toward the sleeping forms of his daughter and the faint outlines of his neighbors' homes, recognized the quiet humor in their shared attempt to outlast the cold. The winter, with its stubborn silence, taught them humility and patience, lessons missed in warmer seasons, perhaps, but now strangely comforting. Light rested on faces blurred by time and tiredness, a reminder that even in the coldest nights, there was a quiet, unspoken unity, and as dawn remained distant, the village slept on, quietly awaiting another day to do what it always did, endure without fuss, with a faint, weary smile of acceptance. As the first cold night settled over the village, the peasants gathered around their worn hearths, uncertain if their modest efforts would withstand the biting air. They added layers of straw and muddy clay around the stones, trying to seal out the frost that seeped through cracks and gaps. The flickering glow of the fire cast tired shadows on faces that had learned to accept the quiet persistence of winter. Children huddled close, clutching small bowls of grain, while adults exchanged murmured instructions about reinforcing the walls and tending to their makeshift insulation. In these small, familiar rituals, there was a fragile hope that warmth might hold another hour longer. Though everyone understood the cold was both patient and relentless. As the nights grew colder, tensions quietly surfaced, fingers numb from handling ice-cold water, thick gloves of fur becoming indispensable for daily chores. Some villagers devised clever methods to harvest ice, carefully cutting small blocks from frozen ponds to reinforce their soddy walls, even if the water was repulsive and their hands stiff. Amidst the routine, the barter trade of dried beans and cheese grew more earnest, as if securing these simple foods might stave off the despair of hunger and hypothermia. The communal effort to keep each other warm became a silent testament to their shared vulnerability, an ironic twist where survival relied on collective labor and scarce, humble resources, humanity's patience in the cold, seeped into their very bones. Quietly stubborn and surprisingly tender, one evening they jokingly remarked that the old prophets' faces were so concealed they might as well be shadows behind light. Their visions blurred into obscurity. No divine guidance came. Only the slow, dull persistence of their own ingenuity. The villagers patched and layered with a kind of resigned humor. Fur-lined cloaks weren't enough, so they traded dried beans for a small patch of more insulating wool. Each exchange a tiny act of defiance against the dark. Their silent laughter mingled with the crackle of dying fires, a reminder that even in hardship, humor lingered in the mundane, unpretentious gestures. The irony that their greatest armor was woven not from divine promise, but from worn fabric, mud, and barter, persisted quietly in the cool night air. In the end, their resourcefulness was both a shield and a mirror of their quiet acceptance of life's persistent chill. Gradually, the cold nights lulled into a calmer rhythm, each day's labor stitching together a fragile, if imperfect, refuge against the winter's grasp. The frost outside seemed to settle into the wooden beams and earthen floors. Yet inside, warmth persisted in small, shared acts, a pot of stew simmering softly, hands briefly warmed by the fire, faces illuminated with a gentle, if weary, contentment. The villagers sat in quiet patience, accustomed to the slow endurance that winter demanded of them. Their faces, often blurred by shadow or softened with sleep, reflected a collective quiet that spoke of resilience in routine. In these moments of calm, the absurdity of their persistent struggle became subtly nourishing, an unspoken acknowledgement that survival took form in simple acts of togetherness and silent perseverance. As dawn gradually crept over the horizon, the villagers quietly prepared for another day to reinforce the hearth, tend to their animals, and slowly chip away at the relentless cold. Their faces, faintly blurred by the morning light, carried the marks of countless nights spent leaning on each other's patience and ingenuity. Though their challenges seemed small, they reflected a universal truth. Humanity's ability to endure often hinges on quiet cooperation, and the faint hope that warmth, like survival, is fragile but enduring. With no grand certainty, but a persistent calmness, they faced the endless winter, a slow parade of ordinary acts forming a subtle story of resilience. Perhaps, in the soft silence of their routine, lay an enduring lesson that life's warmth is always carried forward, one small, mundane effort at a time. On a quiet winter evening, Aldrich's family gathered around their small hearth, the flickering flames casting gentle shadows on wooden beams and simple earthen walls. Outside, the river, once lively with the sound of running water, lay frozen, a glassy sheet beneath a heavy sky, hinting at a cold they had gradually grown accustomed to. The air inside was thick with the smell of dried herbs and bread. A comforting hum of muted conversation filling the sparse space. As night fell, they prepared to settle into their humble beds, uncertain of what chilled darkness might bring. In those still moments, a faint sense of routine rested over them, a fragile peace before the cold's quiet advance. Suddenly, a sharp drop in temperature swept through the village, and the sky seemed to press down heavier. The wind carried away whispers of warmth. The river froze with a brittle crack, and the food stores inside the longhouse felt suddenly more fragile. The central fire, which had burned steadily through the day, flickered and died as embers cooled, leaving the family in a pitch-dark silence, punctuated only by the creak of wood and distant shivering. They fumbled in the darkness, feeling for lanterns and trying to gather spare logs. The absence of heat turned every breath visible, and every cautious movement into a reminder that survival now depended on rationing and careful whispers in the cold rooms. Ironically, in the brittle quiet that followed, a small dispute arose over a piece of bread. The irony that hunger could ignite petty friction in such dire circumstances. Aldrich's children huddled closer, eyes wide and uncertain, as the cold seeped through their clothes and into their bones. The family's efforts to share their meager supplies seemed almost automatic, a routine justification in a world where the cold demanded quiet patience. An old neighbor's voice, muffled through a thin wall, offered a tired reassurance, but the shadow of the frost lingered like an unspoken threat. The irony was gentle but unmistakable. The fiercest battles now were fought without weapons, just discretion and endurance. In the end, the long, cold night left behind more questions than answers, yet quietly underscored the resilience of routine and human endurance. As they mended the fire and measured their supplies, Aldrich's family moved through the day with gentle, understated awareness of what it meant to survive not just the cold, but the tedious, unyielding passage of time. The blurred faces of prophets and wise figures seemed distant and unimportant, their silent shadows unnoticed as the family simply endured. The cold, with all its quiet demands, was a reminder that sometimes the greatest comfort was in the slow, persistent rhythm of ordinary life, an unspoken promise to wait for warmer days that would arrive, eventually, in their own time. As the coldest night settled over the village, the air seemed to press down heavily, curling around the simple wooden cottages and the rough stone, if it could be called that. The villagers gathered slowly, their breaths forming faint clouds as they circled the flickering glow of the communal fire, which struggled against the frost's relentless grip. Aldrich, a broad-shouldered man with weariness etched into his face, took on the quiet role of leader, carefully stacking more logs, and occasionally muttering to himself about the necessity of keeping the flame alive. The faint crackle and hiss of burning wood punctuated the silence, blending into the quiet hum of the wind outside. Everyone knew that survival meant endurance, and that even a small warmth was precious in this endless cold, humbling them to their simple, shared existence amid the dark, frozen night. As the night deepened, a sharp tension arose. Visions of empty granaries haunted their minds, and Aldrich's plan took shape with hesitant urgency. Outside, he began building snow-packed walls around the storerooms, carefully heaping frozen earth into makeshift barriers that promised some protection from the biting wind that threatened to seep in through every crack. Aline, a young woman with eyes searching always for hidden truths in the quiet, noticed a faint, promising trickle beneath the frost near a hollow patch in the ground. Kneeling, she probed with her fingers, the ice giving way to cool, flowing water, an underground spring kept alive beneath the frozen earth. This discovery felt like a quiet gift, feeding their hope that the fire's sputters could be barely sustained, and that perhaps they might outlast the night's unforgiving test of endurance. Irony settled softly into the night as the villagers, with their modest efforts, began to see how fragile their hopes truly were. Aldrich's snow walls grew along the perimeter, but occasionally a gust of wind would breach the barrier, forcing him to patch and reinforce with trembling fingers. Meanwhile, the spring Aline found seemed to risk freezing over at any moment, if not carefully conserved. Yet it provided essential water that kept their fire flickering, just enough, an act of quiet defiance against the cold, mundane reality. It was almost comical how their survival depended on such humble things: a crack in the ice, a small trickle of spring water, G-mints in a delicate dance with nature's indifference. Still, they maintained their calm, and the fire crackled with a steadiness that felt surprising against the vast, unyielding cold outside. As dawn approached, the tension lessened, and a calm descended like a gentle echo, quiet acknowledgement of their small, sustained victory over the night. The villagers, weary and covered in frost, watched the faint light creep through the gaps between the snow walls, casting a soft glow on their weary faces. The fire, though smaller, burned steadily, its warmth enough to nudge their spirits back from the brink of despair. Aline carefully replenished the fire with small pieces of wood, mindful of conserving their precious water supply, while Aldrich looked out across the icy landscape, eyes shaded by a shadowy, unseen figure perhaps a prophet, or maybe just the tired face of history itself. Still, amidst the remnants of the long, silent night, there was a faint sense that survival was simpler than they had feared, simply a matter of patience, modest tools, and shared effort. Looking back on that cold night, the villagers would perhaps find comfort in the quiet lesson it offered, that resilience was often born from humble beginnings and small acts of care. The frost had tested them, pushed their limits with its indifferent persistence, but in their simple acts, building snow walls, finding hidden spring, tending the fire, they had made a fragile peace with the land's relentless silence. The faces of the prophets, or the distant, unseen figures, remained forever blurred by the darkness, and the light, nothing more than shadows or flickers of memory, quietly watching over their cautious lives. If anything, the night revealed that endurance was neither heroic nor dramatic, but quietly woven into the routines of daily, imperfect human effort to survive through the unkindest hours of winter. And by morning, they had already begun to forget how close they came to slipping into the deep, silent sleep of the cold. As dawn slowly crept over the frost-covered fields, the small group of peasants stirred quietly in their worn but sturdy homes. The night had been long and cold, silent except for the occasional cracking of ice and the hum of frozen wind seeping through gaps in the walls. Though weary, they felt a subdued sense of relief. Another WINTER Chinese letter survived. Another night's chill endured with only modest means. Their faces, blurred by the soft morning light, carried traces of sleep and muted triumph. Knowing that survival came from routines no grand prophecy could predict, the earliest rays touched the thatched roofs, casting long, gentle shadows on the uneven ground, as if whispering the faint hope of resilience down through the ages. As the sun rose higher, small tasks resumed with careful, deliberate motion. A woman stirred a simmering pot, while a man checked the insulated walls patched with straw and moss, remnants of last season's makeshift craft. The air still carried a slight sting of winter, but the warmth inside these humble abodes was a quiet victory, earned over years of trial and error. They had learned to share the watch shifts, standing guard in turns, their faint silhouettes flickering in the cold dawn as shadows merge and fade. Somewhere nearby, children's soft footsteps echoed as they peeked out, eyes blinking at the white-iced landscape beyond the smoke-wreathed roofs. Life persisted, quiet and determined, amid the scars of a harsh night. Ironically, amidst their careful routines and rugged ingenuity, some of their most trusted methods came with an unintended humor, like the way they prioritized insulation with bits of old fabric and straw, not always perfectly fitted, sometimes making the walls look more like patchwork quilts than sturdy barriers. On colder nights, stories circulated about the strange, almost comical ways neighbors had improvised fire pits or stacked stones just to keep a little extra heat. Sacred or profane, these stories were shared with a sense of calm irony, as if acknowledging that human imperfection was part of the process. The faces of unseen prophets, hidden behind veils of shadow, seemed to approve in silence, their identities blurred, but their lessons enduring. Even in hardship, humor found a way to seep through cracks, offering a soft reprieve from the relentless cold. By midday, the atmosphere settled into a peaceful calm, with the simple act of sharing bread and herbs marking the slow return of normalcy. The community moved with quiet purpose, repairing, tending, chatting in low voices that barely disturbed the air. Their seasonal rituals, perhaps prayers or offerings, had become part of the fabric that held this fragile society together, woven into the routines that defied the brutal winter darkness. The cold was no longer merely an adversary, but a familiar presence, now slightly softened by the slow unfolding of daylight. The blurred faces of those gone previous nights seemed to look on with mild, amused patience, understanding that this cycle of survival persisted through patience and shared knowledge. In these moments, resilience was less a heroic act and more a slow, steady acceptance. As evening approached, the peasants sat around fires they had learned to build with care, their subdued laughter mingling with the crackling wood. They knew that the lessons learned, insulating walls, vigilant watch shifts, seasonal rituals, would serve not just the present winter but future generations as well. With a modest sense of hope, they acknowledged the quiet victories of their small, imperfect community. Faces now blurred by shadows, they had become part of a long, understated tradition of enduring, leaning into the slow rhythm of seasons and seasons ahead. In the stillness, there was a gentle understanding that survival was less about grand triumphs than about living through each moment, calm, methodical, and resilient in their own quiet way. As the last golden rays of autumn cast a gentle glow over Eldermore, the villagers moved slowly through their fields, gathering the final sheaves of rye and piles of earthy root vegetables. There was a quiet sense of completion in their movements, a ritual of closing one chapter and preparing for the next. Children watched from the fences, their cheeks chilled and noses pink, while Myra, the village elder, surveyed the work with a faint smile that perhaps knew more about hardship than hope. The air carried a subtle dampness, hinting that winter was already whispering at their doorstep, unseen but inevitable. It was a time of quiet acknowledgement that soon the fields would be silent, and survival would depend on what was stored and preserved once the land was still. In those waning days of the season, the community gathered around fires, and within their modest homes to consider the age-old challenge: how to keep their families fed when frost bit into the earth and the fields remained bare. Women and men worked side by side, stacking dried herbs and pressing vegetables into salted barrels, mindful of every small detail: how the salt crusted the cut sides of carrots, how the rye musty but still fragrant after drying. Their techniques, simple yet deliberate, reflected generations of silent practice, all aimed at the quiet resilience that winter demanded. The rhythm was slow, almost meditative, as they methodically caressed each piece of stored produce, knowing they relied on these small acts to outlast the cold months. Ironically, amidst the careful preservation efforts, there was an unspoken humor in their routines. A barrel of fermented cabbage might yawn open with a burp of bubbly brine, or a heap of dried apples might seem to stare back at them with a faint, amused defiance. The villagers joked softly about how the winter would test their patience more than their skill, as if the very act of storing food was a quiet act of defiance against the season's chill and unpredictability. Perhaps in their tired smiles, there was acknowledgement that some of their methods were as much about tradition as they were about practicality, an amusing dance with inevitable decay, wrapped in layers of salt, sugar, and stubborn hope. With these preparations behind them, the villagers settled into a calm acceptance, their routines now less about active planning and more about vigilant awaiting. Inside warm cottages, flickering candlelight reflected softly off earthen walls, and the faint scent of dried herbs and baked bread lingered in the space between seasons. They moved through their days with gentle patience, knowing that every jar sealed, every root buried in sand, was another small act of trust that winter's long silence could be eased. Through the quiet, there was a gentle familiarity, each table and shelf a testament to their quiet effort, their unspoken understanding that survival was a subtle art of patience, not triumph. The world outside remained hushed, as if listening to the slow, rhythmic breathing of hope wrapped in simplicity. Looking back, the villagers of Eldermore might have seen their efforts as modest, their storage pits, their salted vegetables, their dried grains, all ordinary in a way that bordered on the mundane. Yet in this quiet, unremarkable labor, there was a deep, ancient truth. That resilience was woven into the very fabric of routine, embroidered with small acts of patience. Perhaps, in their weariness and humor, they found a gentle humor in the futility of control, knowing that winter's challenges were at once fleeting and endless. As the cold settled in and the last of their harvest was stored away, they rested quietly, comforted by the knowledge that each season's end was but a different way of waiting, calm, slow, and with a faint smile of quiet endurance. As the early winter mornings settled over the village, Myra approached with a calm demeanor, pointing to the low stone pits where the villagers could build modest fires. Her voice was soft but steady, explaining how smoke would slowly soften and preserve the meat, an act of patience and routine that connected them to a quiet tradition. The unfamiliar smell of burning wood mingled with the cold air, and the villagers watched with mild curiosity, listening to her instructions about stacking firewood carefully and maintaining a steady, gentle flame that wouldn't scorch. It was a small ritual, an act of trusting heat and time to safeguard their provisions through the long, frosty months. There was an unspoken hope in the air that this simple method would see them through, or at least buy them some needed comfort amidst the quiet stillness of winter's approach. Amidst the tension, Myra chuckled softly, her face blurred by the shadow cast from the flickering flames, as she pointed out how their makeshift fires produced a strange, uneven glow, neither terribly efficient nor very elegant. The villagers looked on, some with faint smiles, others with a quiet sense of irony at their own improvisation. The smoking peat created a smell both earthy and odd, of bark and stubborn persistence. Despite the discomfort, no one raised their voice. They simply accepted the modest, imperfect effort, as if recognition of their human folly was enough for one day. The small fires endured, humming softly in the cool dusk, marking the quiet persistence of their humble craft. Gradually, the villagers settled into a calm rhythm, tending the fires with an almost meditative patience, watching the smoke curl upward in slow, lazy spirals. Myra's instructions had become almost second nature, her face still obscured, but her presence a steady anchor amid the subtle chaos. The cold seemed less sharp now, dulled by the shared routine, and the warmth that seeped from the imperfect fires into their slender, trembling hands. They understood, perhaps only momentarily, that this slow act of preservation was more about their shared resilience than perfect technique. As evening seeped in, the village rested quietly, the fires crackling softly, a humble testament to their simple hope that the winter's hardship would pass as quietly as it had come. In the stillness of the night, as the stars finally blinked over the subdued village, one might reflect on the quiet irony of it all, how humans, so eager to control the freeze of winter, often found themselves humbled by their own humble efforts. Myra's lessons, little more than careful patience and nearby fires had become a small, enduring act of perseverance. The blurred faces, the soft glow of embers, and the faint scent of salt and bark all spoke to a shared modesty rooted in routine and gentle futility. Perhaps it was in these silent acts, in the imperfect fires and salted meats, that they found a quiet dignity, a reminder that even in the most mundane of human endeavors, there is a subtle grace, an unspoken story of resilience winding through the coldest days. In the quiet hush of winter mornings, villagers would gather around their humble homes, contemplating the sluggish dance of time as they prepared their food for the months ahead. With careful patience, they dug deep into the earth beneath the old village church, shaping hollow spaces that slowly became their silent vaults. Lines of straw and a layer of clay smoothed over the earthen walls, creating a cool, stable environment where potatoes and onions could rest undisturbed through frost and thaw. The air inside these root cellars was perpetually cool and damp, a gentle reminder of human necessity meeting nature's modest mercy. It was a calm, unassuming ritual, performed almost unconsciously, yet essential for survival as winter drew closer with its quiet, persistent chill. As the first frosts finally kissed the fields, the villagers transitioned to their delicate craft of pottery, molding glazed clay pots about the size of a child's head, each one a small vessel of hope. These pots, with their smooth surfaces and rounded forms, were carefully filled with fermented cabbage and turnips, the pungent aromas blending into the chill air. Yet, just as the community felt a certain confidence in their storage methods, dark clouds gathered. An unexpected heavy rain drummed against the rooftops, threatening to seep into the newly crafted shelves. Water began to seep around the base of the earthen walls, threatening to flood the humble cache. The villagers, with their simple tools, began reinforcing the clay walls and double layering their defenses, acutely aware that nature's unpredictable patience sometimes outstripped their own modest efforts. There was a certain irony in their quiet endeavors. These same clay pots, so carefully glazed to contain their humble harvest, now sat precariously on the verge of flooding under a relentless rain. A few villagers looked on, their faces blurred in the waning light, as if unseen prophets of everyday endurance, with only faint smiles suggesting they recognized the absurdity of their diligence against the slow march of weather. They fixed stones around the low walls and pressed more straw into the cracks, all while the rain persisted with patient insistence. The old wooden door creaked slightly as the wind shifted, echoing the slow, sleepy cadence of their routine. It was, after all, a game of patience, leaning ever so slightly toward mild humor at their own expense. This struggle against the inevitable moisture. Gradually, the rain eased, leaving behind a sense of calm that felt almost like a quiet acknowledgement of human resilience. The villagers, now dried and slightly weary, resumed their routines, checking the pots and wiping away the droplets that had escaped, while the earth below their feet cooled into the gentle stillness of winter's hold. The clay walls, thick and slightly cracked, stood silent but steadfast, a symbol of their modest competence and patience. The days grew shorter, and with it, a slow serenity settled over the village, food stored, worries tempered by the slow passage of seasons, and the comforting knowledge that, for now, the cold would stay outside. They sat around communal fires, sharing stories in a subdued tone, their faces peaceful, the absurdities of their efforts already softened by the quiet hours of winter. Looking back, the villagers understood that their simple methods, humble as they were, carried the weight of countless seasons and small human hopes. They had learned to listen to the subtle language of earth and rain, accepting their imperfections with a gentle, weary humor. The deep root cellars and glazed pots had become more than mere storage. They were quiet testaments to patience, resilience, and the slow, unglamorous beauty of everyday survival. As the light faded from the sky and the stars blinked quietly overhead, they rested in the stillness, mindful of their small part in the endless cycle. There was a gentle wisdom in their routine that even in hardship and repetition, life quietly persisted, quietly enduring with a soft, amused patience. As the early dawn light waned into a pale afternoon, a sudden and fierce frost seeped into the valley, snaking across the fields like an uninvited guest. The villagers gazed anxiously at their storage. Smoke-cured hams set out on racks began to stiffen into unexpected hardness, and the cool cellar's moisture suddenly spiked, dampness pooling into unfamiliar puddles on the stones. The fermented turnips, once a humble source of comfort, showed signs of malfunction, dimples of mold spreading like slow, unintended art. In the flickering glow of hearth fires, whispers of worry stirred among the few who still tended to their fragile winter stores, each person quietly aware of their reliance on aging methods that sometimes betrayed them at the worst moments. Clamoring suspicions grew as the day darkened further. The villagers' routines faltered, and the anxious atmosphere thickened. The ham, once a staple of warmth and sustenance, hardened prematurely, while the cellar's humidity made the wooden beams groan under the weight of their own dampness. Meanwhile, the batch of fermented turnips had turned sour. Their foul smell drifted out, prompting visible shudders and a few grimaces. Panic flickered quietly. What if their efforts failed this year? Without clear reason, fears settled like dust on their food, and their resolve, as everyone looked for a simple solution, unsure whether their modest methods could withstand the ruthless, unyielding cold. Amid the growing chaos, a quiet irony emerged in the muted shadows. Myra, an unassuming villager, remembered an old, almost forgotten technique. She had once watched her grandfather bury salted grains in the snow as a child, a practice dismissed as relic. Now, she hesitated just long enough to gather handfuls of coarse salt and handfuls of grains before carefully pressing them into a patch of pristine, untouched snow outside the cellar door. The snow was a natural freezer, she thought, a simple, humble place to buy precious days. The grains disappeared beneath the white blanket, protected temporarily from the ruthless frost, their fate uncertain, but temporarily safe from spoilage and panic. That quiet action, performed with gentle patience, seemed almost insignificant in the grand, relentless march of winter. As the days passed, the villagers gradually returned to their routines, their attention partly diverted by the slow, steady rhythm of life, birds settling into their nests, shadows lengthening, and the snow slowly absorbing the sun's weaker warmth. The salted grains underneath their camouflage of white seemed to hold a secret, a small, silent victory in a season that often rewarded patience and modest innovation. The scare of spoiled food softened into a distant memory, replaced by a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, simple humility rooted in the land itself might stand against the cold's quiet but persistent theft. In the end, the frost passed, leaving behind a landscape tinged with muted colors and the faint smell of turning earth. The villagers reflected in their modest ways, while their methods could never compete with modern ingenuity. There was comfort in the small acts of preservation that endured through time. Myra's snow-buried grains sat quietly in the larder, a testament to humility and shared history, a reminder that sometimes survival depended less on grand plans and more on the gentle knowledge passed down between seasons. The blurred faces of their ancestors, unseen yet present, seemed to nod softly in approval as the valley prepared itself for the next winter, with quiet resilience and a faint, enduring sense of communal calm. As the last snow melts and the cold wind softens, the villagers, with slow, deliberate movements, begin to uncover the remnants of their winter efforts. Baskets of dried herbs and bundles of smoked meat sit quietly, awaiting the moment when they will be shared and appreciated. Their eyes, faintly tired but steady, carry the familiar weight of relying on these quiet harvests to sustain them through months of silence. In these small, routine actions, there is a flicker of hope, an understanding that life's steady persistence must be honored, even in its simplest forms. Perhaps in this calm, the true essence of survival reveals itself, not in grand devices, but in the patient patience of waiting and quietly persevering. One morning, amidst the hum of distant birds, the peasants gathered to inspect their carefully preserved supplies. Muffled sounds fill the air, clinking of jars, the soft scrape of wooden spoons on earthenware. Yet beneath this routine, there's an undertone of quiet tension, a reminder that their stores remain fragile. A leak ferment bubbles faintly, hinting at the precarious balance between freshness and spoilage, and the smoked meat offers only limited assurance. The humbleness of their toil is suddenly underscored by the faint irony that, in protecting their food, they are also guarding their fragile hopes for survival. The air feels both still and charged, like the pause before a rainstorm. As days pass, the anticipation of spring's warmth mingles with a subtle humor. How humans, with modest knowledge and rough tools, have turned simple ingredients into a small fortress of resilience. A peasant with half-remembered recipes chuckles softly at the idea that their fermented vegetables and salted grains might one day be called preservation techniques. Their hand-me-down methods, humble in appearance, carry an ironic gravitas as they quietly defy the relentless march of spoilage and decay. In the dim light of early mornings, these small acts of preservation seem both serious and absurd, like a silent acknowledgement of their shared human stubbornness. Everything in its time, and everything in its imperfect way, remains untidy but enduring. With the long, slow approach of spring, the community begins to settle into a calm routine, still aware of the world's unpredictable turns, but finding comfort in their gathered strength. The scent of fermenting cabbages and smoked meats hangs gently in the air, a soft reminder of the work they poured into these quiet victories. Days drift by in predictable harmony, punctuated only by the gentle clatter of daily chores. Their faces, shaded by dull light, reveal no great triumph, only a shared understanding that the work was enough. In this stillness, there is a quiet dignity, a recognition that their small ecosystem of effort is a fragile but constant act of faith in the future's slow arrival. In the quiet high valley of Frosthaven, the ancient communal hall stood as a quiet witness to countless cold winter nights. As twilight faded into darkness, villagers gathered slowly, their breath forming fleeting clouds in the chilly air. Elder Mara, her face blurred in shadow, yet somehow still commanding, called upon the hunters, including the youthful Leo, whose eyes carried a mixture of curiosity and uneasy responsibility. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and cold earth, and the flickering glow of the hearth cast gentle shadows on rough-hewn walls. All felt the weight of the dwindling supplies, yet there was a silent understanding that this shared space must hold them through the deepening winter. As the meeting stretched into its quiet hours, a faint tension settled whispered concerns of outliving the seasonal stockpiles, humbly competing with the warmth of the fire. Hunter Leo, restless, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, listening to elders speak of past seasons when the communal efforts had prevented hardship. The children's muffled giggles receded into the background as the danger of scarcity flickered at the edge of thought. Somewhere in the shadows, the face of the village's old prophet remained unseen, hidden behind diffused light, offering no words, only an ambiguous presence. The simple planning was tinged with irony. Despite their collective efforts, the winter's endurance was still so fragile, contingent on modest pieces of knowledge passed down like fragile relics. The slow rhythm of the gathering, intertwined with creaking wooden beams and faint crackling of the hearth, brought a strange calm. Mara's voice became softer as she recounted stories from years long past, tales admittedly tinged with exaggeration, meant to bolster spirits rather than instruct. The hunters nodded quietly, their faces showing nodding fatigue or mild amusement at shared memories of past hunts, each one a small triumph or a minor mishap. The fire's amber glow cast a warm but fading light, as if mocking the certainty their future held. A faint, ironic humor arose from the thought that even in hardship, humans retained a stubborn, often humorous persistence, clinging to warmth and stories, as if those could somehow stave off winter itself. Later, as the villagers settled into quieter routines, the hall's atmosphere drifted into a peaceful stillness. The fire burned low, spotlights of warm orange flickering on faces now relaxed, some sleepy, some simply waiting for dawn. Outside, the wind's lament crossed the wooden beams, indifferent to human worries. Mara's shadow, no longer the commanding figure, but a gentle presence, sat quietly among the others, reflecting on how the simple act of gathering kept the cold at bay, at least for the night. There was a quiet mastery in their endurance, a shared patience that felt almost timeless. In these moments, human effort seemed to blur with acceptance, and the absurd hope that coherence and community alone could outwit the winter's endless patience. In the stillness of that night, the village of Frosthaven found a quiet dignity in the ordinary. The hearth's faint glow and the soft murmurs of shared silence whispered the truth. Survival was, after all, a modest, imperfect thing. As dawn approached, the sky lightened ever so slightly, a pale reminder that even in tiredness, life persisted. Mara and the others rested, their faces peaceful, each aware that these humble gatherings, these carefully held flames, were the fragile threads that held them close through the coldest seasons. It was not heroic grandeur, but simple persistence that shaped their history quietly and softly, year after year, in the slow rhythm of human endurance. As dusk settled over the village, the communal hall became a humble sanctuary against the encroaching cold. Villagers gathered slowly, exchanging quiet greetings while the last of the daylight slipped behind the distant hills. Their faces, softened by time and wear, carried a gentle patience, each one aware that the winter nights offered both shelter and silent challenge. The crackling hearth awaited their logs, promising warmth, but also hinting at the shortages looming ahead. Among the assembled, a sense of peaceful reliance held steady, one rooted in routines and shared space, rather than absolute certainty of survival. But as the storm outside persisted without pause, the air grew tense with an unspoken question. Who would receive the remaining logs? A small dispute surfaced, murmured and slow, over the few bundles saved for the coldest hours. People hesitated, their expressions flickering between reluctance and stubbornness, caught in a quiet standoff. The snow drummed softly on the thatched roof, a relentless percussion to the subtle friction within the hall. It was a fragile moment. Unity was tangible, yet strained by the sparse supplies and the shared vulnerability of their plight. Ironically, the villagers' voices, meant to defend their needs, seemed to carry a faint, almost humorous undertone, like a slow, weary play with no villains, only tired characters. Someone with a small, resigned gesture pointed out how even prophets' faces, obscured and shadowed, seemed to warn silently against greed. Gentle reminders of kinship floated across the room, often met with a quiet shrug or a half smile, as if human nature itself had become the oddest, most enduring fixture of their winter nights. The logs, now a symbol of both warmth and division, lay in shadows just beyond reach, like the faint hope of sustenance beyond the immediate. Gradually, a calm settled over the hall, softening the sharp edges of conflict. The villagers slid closer together, sharing their remaining logs as if it were a practiced ritual rather than a heated exchange. The cold seeped through cracks in the walls, but they paid it little mind. Their focus was on stillness and the quiet acceptance that even in scarcity, there was a certain peace in enduring together. The light from the hearth flickered gently on their faces, revealing expressions less engaged in argument and more in quiet contemplation, half asleep, half aware of the passing hours. Behind the smoke and hum of the wind, a faint, enduring humor persisted, silent, perhaps, but present in the way they moved and waited. Later, as the night deepened and the storm's fury eased, the villagers reflected on their shared experience, a reminder of both their resilience and the gentle absurdity of human effort. The hall, now still, seemed to breathe with the slow rhythm of tired hearts and creaking timbers. In the soft darkness, the blurred images of prophets' faces in distant memories flickered faintly, suggesting that hope, like warmth, resided more in their quiet endurance than in any visible flame. They would wait again for the dawn and the promise of a new day, with all its small, uncertain miracles. And beneath that calm, a gentle irony lingered their survival, fragile, yet somehow enduring, was woven into the slow, unremarkable weave of ordinary life. On a dull evening in a quiet village, the communal hall's hearth was the center of life, a sturdy stone circle where warmth and stories intertwined. As the cold seeped in through chinks in the walls, villagers gathered around, tending its gentle glow, unaware that this comfort was as fragile as a thin layer of ash. The fire crackled softly, whispering of shared routines, before a sudden gust sneaked through a weak seam and shattered the hearth's central stone, leaving the cold air to flood in. The flickering flames died instantly, leaving only darkness and an unsettling silence as quiet figures looked at one another, uncertain. Outside, the wind carried faint howls, hinting at the wolves circling in the shadows, while inside, the group's quiet mistrust began to stew in the absence of fire's simple reassurance. Faced with the sudden darkness and the encroaching threat, Leo, the village's most reluctant organizer, shifted uneasily, eyes fixed on the frozen doorway. The villagers hesitated, some muffling their shivers or glancing nervously at the perimeter, where the faint silhouettes of wolves lurked. An unwelcome plan formed, rooted in necessity. They must brave the woods to fetch new timber, risking the cold and the unpredictability outside. The group's hurried whispering grew tense, filled with unspoken fears about outsiders, about the forest's hostile silence, and about their own unpreparedness. Yet defiance of nature's fury became a quiet duty, etched into their routines as they debated who should go and how to face the harsh night. Ironic, perhaps, that survival often depended on the willingness to confront what one fears most. The irony of their situation settled like a slow breath in the room. Here they stood, scared but compelled, about to walk into the dark, knowing well that the wolves circled quietly, eyes gleaming even without the flickering firelight. As Leo prepared the old cart, the villagers smirked at their own caution, recognizing in themselves the absurdity of collective mistrust and the fragile veneer of safety. Outside, the wind howled in mockery, weaving through the trees with a dull, persistent moan. The few lanterns cast warm, hollow circles on the snow, pinpricks of comfort in the deepened shadow. The shared humor in their helplessness offered a faint balm to the tension, a quiet acknowledgement that humans, after all, often thrive best amidst their own ironic vulnerability. The cold night settled heavily around them as they stepped into the quiet woods, each breath forming faint clouds in the crisp air. Miraculously, the trees creaked in slow patience, and the bare branches bore the weight of ice, shimmering like quiet sentinels. Leo led the way, the others trailing behind, their movements hesitant yet determined, an ordinary scene punctuated by the soft scrape of snow and muted footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's low growl lingered briefly, then faded into the hush. They worked in a subdued harmony, fetching logs that seemed heavy with unspoken fears, yet strangely light with the shared purpose of survival. At moments, the absurdity struck them anew, that some nights required such small, slow victories to keep the fire of community alight. As dawn gently broke, the villagers returned, carrying the season's first fresh timber and a quiet sense of modest achievement. The hearth was soon relit, its crackling flame a soft, familiar lullaby. With the fire rekindled, the village settled into its customary calm, shadows retreating from the edges of the hall. The morning light revealed no heroism, only tired faces, and the slow, deliberate act of restoring what was lost. They sat in silence, watching the flames dance, each person reflecting inwardly on the strange, subtle beauty of survival in a world that was both unpredictable and quietly enduring. In that stillness, they understood, in all its irony, that perhaps the greatest safeguard was simply sharing the cold night together and waiting for the day to quietly return. In the quiet villages gathering around their communal halls, the evenings often began with a slow flicker of hope. As villagers returned with bundles of timber, their breath forming faint clouds in the cold air, the hall's hearth had long fallen silent, its stones dark and unyielding, awaiting the comforting warmth of a fire that seemed just out of reach. Faces, blurred by the low, diffuse glow of the failing flames, carried a mixture of quiet tiredness and fleeting anticipation, as if everyone understood the slow rhythm of survival. It was a routine marked more by patience than by urgency. Each small step was a silent testament to human perseverance amid the unforgiving cold. Somewhere in the background, indistinct voices murmured, carrying stories and silent prayers, while the night crept ever closer outside the thick walls. Tension settled in as the villagers set about rebuilding the fire, their movements deliberate but uncertain, aware of the fragility of their collective warmth. Mara, known quietly for her careful hands and unspoken kindness, hesitated as she reached for her treasured cloak, an old garment woven with memories of warmer days, and laid it aside, choosing instead to sacrifice her comfort for the fire's revival. The new flames flickered hesitantly at first, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mock the effort. And for a moment, the air thickened with a strange, ironic sense of loss. They knew that the fire's return was both a renewal and a fragile, fleeting thing. Outside, unseen predators, perhaps wolves or wolves' echoes, watched and waited, retreating once the fire's glow pushed back the darkness. The hall's occupants, however, felt a small, shared relief, slipping into a muted hope that slowly steadied their hearts as the flames roared back to life, crackling softly against the cold stones. There was an almost humorous irony in the villagers' collective effort. How the smallest sacrifice, that of Mara's cherished cloak, managed to ignite a better tomorrow, if only briefly. The fire's surges of heat seemed to toast not only the cold, but also the quiet absurdity of human endurance. In the flickering light, faces once half-shadowed now appeared mildly amused, their expressions a mixture of fatigue and gentle humor. The hall, filled with the smell of burning wood and the distant sounds of settling beams, seemed to breathe once more, as if sighing in relief. Outside, the cold remained relentless, but within, a fragile circle of warmth and shared purpose had been temporarily restored, a testament to their stubborn unity. Mara's silent sacrifice became a quiet joke, perhaps even to herself. That warmth often came at a small, quiet cost. With the fire now steady and crackling with life, the atmosphere settled into a calm rhythm. Villagers resumed their quiet activities, knitting, sharing unspoken stories, and tending to minor worries, while the hall radiated a gentle, steady heat. The faces, though still blurred, showed a peaceful patience, as if acknowledging that each cold night was but a small chapter in a much longer story of endurance. The flickering flames hummed softly, casting a warm glow on hands that clasped mugs or sorted through humble supplies, the simple acts grounding them in the slow certainty of survival. Outside, the harshness of the night pressed gently against the walls, but inside, the collective quiet reserved a serene magic, an unspoken agreement that tonight they had shared something intangible, a reassurance that they would face another dawn. The hall, in its modest way, remained a quiet sanctuary for resilience and for human imperfection. As morning gradually peered through the small, frost-framed windows, the villagers paused briefly in their routines, gazing at the remaining embers and the now dormant flames. Mara, her face softened by weariness and an almost amused sense of modest pride, folded her cloak carefully, knowing that each night's challenge was a slow but steady reminder of their fragile humanity. Reflecting as they cleaned and prepared for the day, they quietly understood that these small acts of sacrifice, patience, and shared effort were woven into the larger, imperfect tapestry of village life. The hall, once again emptied of its warmth, retained a faint, lingering glow, a silent testament to the human capacity for small courage amid ongoing hardship. Somewhere distant, the calls of dawn stirred the cold air, while inside, the villagers carried with them the quiet certainty that tonight's warmth was only a fleeting gift, but an enduring memory of their collective, quiet strength. Even with the hearth's glow, the night often carried a tense silence, as if everyone individually listened for the distant crack of ice shifting outside, or the faint whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls. Stories of earlier cold nights became ritual, told softly but with an unmistakable weight. Tales of near frostbite, of lost herbs, of cold that crept past every shelter's wall. Young voices rose timidly, asking why it was so cold, only to be gently reminded that survival was always a shared effort, that the fire was a communal victory as much as a physical necessity. The blurred face of some aged prophet might have watched over this ritual, unseen but present, whispering that these stories kept hope alive through the slow easing of dread. As the night stretched on, the illusion of individual effort was replaced by collective endurance, stitched together in stories told and retold around the embers. Yet amid the quiet unity, a subtle irony stirred. The very stories meant to soothe sometimes revealed the fragile human condition. In the dim light, villagers chuckled softly at tales of miscalculated fires that nearly burnt their homes, or of frozen loaves that refused to thaw. The old storyteller, face shaded slightly by the flickering flames, would seem to hide a knowing smile, as if amused by their own reliance on such fragile, imperfect things. The blurred, shadowed figure of a village elder might have nodded, listening not just with their ears, but with the soft humor in their eyes, recognizing that survival was less about perfect management and more about persistence. A daily dance with minor failures, the irony nestled comfortably, a reminder that even in hardship, life persisted with a humorous patience that was quietly heroic. Eventually, the night mellowed into a soft calm, as all in the hall settled into a slow, restful silence. The children curled closer to their parents, fingers tracing the rough textures of woven blankets, while adults shifted slightly on their low benches, eyes softly fixed on the dying fire. Outside, The wind's whisper seemed to soften, as if deciding not to disturb a moment of fragile peace. In this stillness, the communal hall stood not only as a refuge, but as a testament to their shared endurance, a simple yet lasting symbol of human resilience. Some villagers might have occasionally glanced upward, distant faces lost in thought, pondering the strange comfort of shared hardship. Here, in the quiet glow, survival was no longer an individual act, but a collective story, written into the very walls and hearth of their humble refuge. Looking back, the village's approach to endless cold nights reveals a quiet morality. That survival is a communal choice, stitched together in stories, shared silence, and warm stones. The communal hall, with its flickering hearth and worn benches, had become more than a shelter. It was a reflection of human imperfection, paired with enduring hope. Faces blurred in shadow reminded them that no prophet saw clearly in these moments, only the gathered patience of many hands and minds. As dawn finally hinted on the horizon, the villagers moved slowly, carrying with them the silent strength of another night survived together. In the quiet, they understood that if the cold tested their bodies, their shared hearths and stories tested their spirits. Ordinary, imperfect, persistent, and quietly human. In the faint light of early winter mornings, Tomas and his mother Mara stood inside their modest cottage, the air thick with the faint scent of lanolin and damp wool. Outside, flecks of snow began to drift lazily onto the thatched roof, a quiet sign that the cold season had indeed arrived. Mara carefully unfolded a bundle of homespun wool, observing how its soft, uneven fibers promised insulation against the biting wind. Tomas looked on with sleepy, half-interested eyes, barely understanding that these simple layers of fabric and fur were armor against the cold that seeped into their bones. The village, with its crooked wooden fences and smoke-wreathed chimneys, already seemed to shiver in anticipation of the winter ahead. It was, after all, a slow, enduring struggle, one that mostly revolved around keeping warm in the quiet, unwavering rhythm of daily life. As the day grew colder, Mara began layering Tomas's clothing with deliberate care linen shirts beneath rough wool tunics, topped with a faded leather vest, and finally, a heavy wool cloak lined with a fur collar that scratched just slightly at the neck. Tomas absently tugged at the layers, the fabric coarse against his skin, a silent protest to the simple necessity of warmth. Outside, the wind whispered through the village, making the thin rags of their homes' shutters rattle softly, as if mocking the effort to stay warm. Mara's hands moved instinctively, a quiet, practiced rhythm amid the slow, bleeding town, waking in its own unhurried unhurried way. Even amidst the tensions of seasonal preparation, there was a strange comfort in having done this many times before, as if their layered garments formed a silent pact with the cold, neither fully victorious nor defeated. There was a peculiar irony in their winter wardrobe furniture of battered cloaks and mismatched layers that managed to serve the purpose of insulation, but sometimes looked more like worn costumes. Tomas snuck a glance at his fur-lined hat, which sat lopsided on his head, covered in patches of the same rough wool. Mara, with her careful but weary eyes, chuckled softly at her son's distracted fussing, muttering something about farmer's fashion. Outside, the snow had thickened, covering the village in a dull, white blanket, like a reluctant peace offering to winter's relentless grasp. The small ritual of bundling up revealed not only the practical ingenuity of their clothing, but also a gentle, ironic patience for the slow, unending cold that seemed to poke its nose into every stitch and seam. It was, after all, a kind of quiet acceptance that their warmth depended on layers and fur, rather than on sparks or magic. By late afternoon, Tomas and Mara sat beside a small, smoky hearth, their layered cloaks pulled tight against the growing chill. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows over their tired faces, which looked peacefully resigned to the rhythm of this ongoing cold season. Mara ran her fingers along the rough linen of Tomas's shirt, her expression calm, almost contemplative. They had learned to trust the layered fabric, their insulation against the biting wind, the snow, and the long, dark nights. Outside, the snow's silence seemed almost sacred, a reminder of the enduring stillness that winter brought. And in that quiet, layered moment, they found a modest calm, an acceptance of their simple, layered days, each layer a tiny act of quiet resilience in a world wrapped tightly in winter's embrace. Sometimes, in the muted glow of nearing dusk, Tomas would stare at his reflection in a puddle, bundled in threadbare layers, and wonder if it was enough, if the thick wool and fur were truly enough against the cold that persisted beyond their small world. Mara, watching him, realized that these humble garments and outdoor layers marked not just survival, but a quiet human dignity, woven carefully into each stitch and patch. As shadows lengthened and the winter night deepened, their modest clothing stood quietly as a testament to their patience and perseverance, an unspoken acknowledgement that, in the slow life of Brackenford, warmth was an enduring act of human patience, stitched into every layer they wore. And perhaps, in the end, that was more than enough, just enough to carry them through another frosty beginning, softly, silently, onward. On chilly mornings, the village's modest loom sat quietly in the corner of Mara's cottage, where her fingers gently stretched and combed flax fibers, expecting little more than to keep her family warm through another winter. Tomas, wide-eyed and eager, watched as the weaver's needles moved with steady, deliberate rhythm, knitting tighter twills that promised a bit more insulation, a small act of hope against the creeping cold. The air was thick with the scent of wool, straw, and earth, each material quietly bearing the weight of survival. Outside, frost clung softly to rooftops, and the landscape seemed to exhale slow, gray breaths into the morning light. It was a time of patience, of small adjustments, where warmth came from the smallest details stitched into everyday life and routines that felt both timeless and transient. As the cold deepened, Mara experimented with animal pelts, trying to soften and layer them beneath her simplest garments, while Tomas learned to sew double-stitched seams that might better hold back the cold. The days stretched long into nights, filled with the scratch of spindle wheels and the rhythmic tug of thread, each stitch a quiet act of defiance against the biting wind. Yet, sometimes, the irony of it all revealed itself. A garment that was supposed to insulate might make a person's arms itch or become stiff with too many layers, a reminder that human effort was often imperfect and require constant adjustment. The weather remained indifferent, its chill relentless, unbothered by the small human efforts to insulate against it. Still, they persisted in their humble craft, stitching, stuffing, and layering, knowing that each small improvement was a quiet victory of sorts. Irony lingered in the way Mara's straw-stuffed mittens felt oddly light, yet failed to keep her fingers warm in the wind, while Tomas's taut weaves sometimes betrayed tiny gaps in the seams where cold seeped through. A testament to human fallibility amid the pursuit of warmth. The household was filled with faint sounds, thunk of bone needles, the whisper of fabric, faint breathing, each moment an ordinary but essential part of survival. The snow silently gathered outside as they continued their work, the effort based more in hope than certainty. In those small acts of stitching and stuffing, there was a kind of stubborn serenity, an acceptance that slight flaws and imperfect crafts mirrored their uneasy harmony with an unforgiving season. There was nothing heroic about it, just the quiet, ongoing assertion of human persistence against the indifferent cold. With time, Mara came to see her makeshift mittens and layered shirts as small acts of comfort, woven into the slow rhythm of daily life that somehow eased the sharpness of winter's grasp. Tomas's stitches became steadier, more deliberate, almost meditative, as he appreciated the quiet importance of each thread drawn through coarse fabric. In In the soft glow of evening fires, they exchanged tired but knowing glances, understanding that warmth was both a craft and a state of mind. The landscape outside remained hushed and static, a backdrop to their humble efforts, while inside the cottage, life persisted in muted, steady harmony. The season's harshness was undeniable, yet within mundane routines there lay a gentle dignity, a silent acknowledgement of resilience, woven into every layer they added, every stitch they made. Now, decades later, the stories of thread and straw seem almost like gentle echoes of a quiet past, reminders that even the simplest human acts hold a sense of grace. Mara's patched mittens and Tomas's worn seams are now mere shadows in distant memory. Yet they symbolize endurance in its ordinary form, stitched slowly into the fabric of history. The cold still returns in winter, but perhaps, in some small way, humanity's modest efforts to layer and insulate have left behind a subtle warmth, an understated legacy of patience and ingenuity. As light fades softly on fields long fallen silent, one might wonder whether the true comfort was ever in the layers themselves, or in the quiet, persistent testament of those who knitted their survival with thread, straw, and hope. And so the village rests, waiting for another season to quietly resume its slow, unassuming dance with the cold. On a quiet morning in early winter, the village of worn stone cottages faced a sudden chill that seeped unexpectedly into the air. The peasants, bundled in woolen layers of varying thickness, coarse tunics, rough cloaks, and patched trousers, shuffled through their daily routines, unaware of the freeze that would soon demand more than their usual warmth. As the sky grayed, a faint breeze rattled window shutters, and the faint scent of damp wood mingled with the sharp crispness of frost. In this slow, familiar landscape, no one paid much mind to the chill. It was simply another seasonal transition, inevitable and quietly accepted. Still, the looming threat of the cold deepened, settling into the bones of both land and people, whispering of hardships yet to come. When the temperature dropped further, and the fields remained stubbornly bare of harvestable crops, anxiety crept into the routines. The villagers faced a sudden scarcity. No firewood was left, and the fires in the hearths flickered with reluctant life. Rumors of a shortage of warm wool spread quietly, and the mayor's voice, blurred and shadowed, summoned the villagers to journey to the distant market for more supplies. Walking icy, cracked roads they knew well, they felt the sting of slick stones beneath their feet and the wind's unkind bite. The layered fabrics, once sufficient, now seemed inadequate against the relentless cold. Their quiet resilience was tested as they moved slowly toward a distant fate. each step a small act of enduring despite the discomfort. Ironically, amid the cold severity, the townsfolk found a certain dark humor in their layered garments. A pigtailed girl, struggling into her thickest tunic, tripped over her own worn-out shoes, causing a soft chuckle to ripple through a clutch of older women. The sight of farmers plodding along bundled in multiple cloaks, almost resembling walking haystacks, prompted knowing smiles that refused to melt away entirely. It was as though their collective effort to stay warm had, in a way, become an unintentional costume, one both absurd and endearing. The cold, although relentless, had drawn out these small moments of shared humor, anchoring them amid the hardship's slow tide. Even in discomfort, human nature persisted, slightly amused, quietly defiant. As they trudged back through the ice-glinted landscape, the urgent need for firewood and wool softened into a muted rhythm of patience. The villagers, now more aware of their layered defenses, coarse underclothes beneath warm woolen shirts, heavy cloaks layered over all, moved with a calm acceptance. Their breath formed fleeting clouds in the cold air as they talked little, focusing on the quiet act of survival. The community, woven together by shared effort and historic routines, found comfort in the slow, steady rhythm of gathering and waiting. Despite the bitter wind, they sat by their fires in modest, multi-layered attire, acknowledging that resilience was often just the quiet endurance of everyday moments. Here, in their layered silence, they found a fragile peace. In the end, the village's response to the cold was a gentle reminder of human perseverance, dressed in the humble, layered clothing that held back the worst of winter's grasp. The blurred faces of prophets or divine figures remained unseen. Their presence felt more in the steady heartbeat of everyday life than in any sacred gesture. As the season eased into a calmer frost, the villagers reflected on their modest, practical methods: thick wool, patchwork garments, careful fuel use, and the patience to wait out the storm. It was a slow story of everyday resilience, ordinary, slightly humorous, and quietly profound, woven into the fabric of their lives, like the very weave of hardship that kept them warm. Perhaps, in such simplicity, there was a lesson in quiet endurance, if only one was slow enough to notice. As the early gray light seeped into the village of Brackenford, Tomas carefully adjusted his newly woven coat. Each layer of wool and linen neatly layered to trap what little warmth the cold morning offered. The wind outside whispered through crevices, reminding everyone that winter's grip was unrelenting. Yet the morning's quiet routine persisted: clattering pots, footsteps on frozen earth, and the faint crackle of a hearth-catching flame. Tomas mindful of the slipping temperature, had poured effort into his layered garments, believing warmth was a matter of strategy, not just fabric. Mara, watching him, wrapped herself in her fur-filled cloak, its weight a comfort against the chilling air that hinted at a harder day ahead. They paused in the quiet, exchanging a subtle glance of shared resilience, knowing the cold would test the simple safety their clothing provided. Amidst the chaos, there was an almost ironic stillness in the way Tomas and Mara moved, each step slow, deliberate, as if in quiet acknowledgement of human imperfections. Their layered clothing, so carefully crafted, did not turn the storm away, but slowed them, making each movement a conscious effort, a reminder that warmth was always a fragile shield. As snow piled and wind shrieked, they managed to reach the trapped neighbors, their coats and cloaks contributing to thick silhouettes in the swirling whiteness. The storm raged on, relentless, and their efforts seemed modest against such a vast, indifferent force. Yet it was enough to keep spirits tethered to hope, however thin that hope might appear amid the chaos. In these moments, the irony of human adjustment, dressing for cold only to be battered by it, became quietly apparent. As the storm gradually subsided, a calm settled over Brackenford, softening the harshness of the earlier tempest. Tomas and Mara, exhausted but undeterred, returned to their humble hearths, each bundled in their layered garments and insulating furs. The wind's whine faded into a distant hum, and the snow lay still and heavy on the ground, reflecting the late afternoon's muted light. The village's resilience was stitched into each layer of fabric, each fur split and woolen fold, quietly bearing the weight of many such seasons. The moment of calm was simple. Almost mundane firewoods crackled, and neighbors exchanged weak but warm smiles over shared minor damages. Their layered clothing, once just practical attire, had proved itself a crucial part of their small, collective endurance. Reflecting now, in the fading evening glow, it was clear that the village's story was stitched into the fabric of their everyday lives. Every coat, every layer, each insulative method a testament to ongoing human adaptation. Tomas's thoughtfully layered coat and Mara's fur-filled cloak had become more than mere clothing. They were silent witnesses to the quiet persistence that carried people through nature's indifferent seasons. In the calm after the storm, one could see the subtle humor in human hopes, believing that with enough wool and fur, they could hold back winter, even as winter's wide, unyielding presence remained. As the last light waned, the villagers settled once again into their routines, quietly grateful for the simple truth. Clothing and patience are, after all, the best defenses against the relentless cold of time and weather. As morning light waned, the villagers slowly emerged from their thatched huts, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and cold wool. Their simple clothing, multiple layers of coarse linens, rough spun shirts, and thick cloaks, offered a modest shield against the gray, biting wind. Some brushed damp hair from tired faces, each mindful of how their layered garments had become almost like second skin, insulators drawn from necessity rather than fashion. It was a start to another day of routine. Yet beneath the surface, the shadows of winter's harsh grip lingered, quietly pressing into their bones. The silence of the village felt more settled than usual, almost resigned, as if the cold had seeped into everything, including their patience. Humanity's age-old dance with the cold was neither triumphant nor tragic. It simply persisted, quietly and patiently. By midday, the weather shifted unmistakably. Snows whipped sideways, and clouds hung heavy like burdens neither lifted nor shared. The villagers paused, clutching their layered cloaks tighter, feeling the shifting weight of the storm's relentless pressure. Tomas and Mara, seasoned in their cloth-wrapped crafts, watched as younger hands tugged at haphazardly patched scarves, trying to hold back the cold's insidious creeping. Their stories, half-whispered, spoke of thermals woven from sheep's wool, and the clever folding of layers to trap heat, details passed down as if they were secrets of survival, quietly celebrated for their modest ingenuity. Even amidst hardship, irony flickered. Their careful layering, once a practical necessity, often seemed a slow dance of patience with the cold, never truly conquering, but merely enduring. The storm roared outside, a reminder of winter's persistence and their humble resilience. As the storm's roar ebbed into a distant hum, the villagers gathered at the warm hearths, their faces worn but calm, as if weary humor had become their quiet defiance. Tomas chuckled softly about the time he tried to make a thicker coat by stuffing hay between layers, only to find it more itchy than warm. Mara offered gentle corrections, her voice blending with the crackle of burning wood, reminding everyone how a simple linen shirt could be coated with animal fat for added insulation, an irony of human folly and ingenuity intertwined. The quiet humor, half embarrassed and half proud, floated amid the hum of conversation, each story a small testament to human imperfection and the stubborn warmth of shared knowledge. There was a soft comfort in knowing that even the smartest layered clothing could never quite escape winter's cold humor, which lingered unspoken in every fold and stitch. Lying back on benches and resting their tired limbs, the villagers allowed themselves a slow breath, their thoughts drifting peacefully like the faint glow of sunset. Tomas and Mara, now regarded as masters, sat side by side, softly instructing a curious youth on how to properly fold and relayer their cloaks as the seasons change. Their hands moved deliberately, adjusting fabrics, wool, linen, padded furs, a subtle symphony of human smallness against the vast winter. In these quiet moments, the tension of survival softened, replaced by a gentle acceptance that warmth was less about victory and more about patience. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and wool, almost like a quiet lullaby that told humans that their efforts, humble as they were, had made these cold nights ever so slightly more bearable. It was a peaceful pause, driven not by triumph, but by the simple act of enduring together. Later, as twilight settled, the villagers' thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the long, slow journey of human adaptation. They understood that their layered garments, with all their patches and shortcuts, spoke more of modest resilience than of mastery over winter's cruelty. Tomas and Mara's teachings had become subtle traditions, like whispered stories that threaded through generations, carried in the quiet routines of daily life. As the long night approached, wrapped in layers woven with patience and humor, they grasped in a small way the unspoken truth. Warmth was not merely in the fabric, but in the shared patience of humanity facing an indifferent cold. Beneath the muted light, human imperfection found its quiet place in the endless, slow effort to make life a little warmer, an imperfect, enduring act of gentle defiance. In a quiet, windswept valley of the 12th century, villagers gathered beneath a sprawling, gnarled oak as the first biting frost crept across the fields. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of damp earth and fallen leaves, while their worn cloaks offered little protection from the early cold. Elder Marta stepped forward, her face blurred by shadows cast by the weak evening light, and began recounting the old stories handed down through generations. Stories about how the oak spirits listened silently to their humble pleas, especially when winter's hardship was at its peak. It was a time to hope, to trust in the ancient rites, even if no one quite understood how the spirits might be listening. The villagers nodded, clutching their simple charms and tokens, feeling both comforted and a little weary beneath the weight of winter's approach. As the days shortened and the first frosts etched jagged patterns on window panes, tension settled over the village like a slow, encroaching fog. Some neighbors hesitated in their routines, worried that perhaps the old ways would not be enough this year. What if the spirits had grown silent? Children's laughter faded into quiet whispers, and the elders pressed their palms against cold wood, muttering prayers to unseen forces, all the while watching the darkening sky. Marta's voice, soft and steady, reminded them that their faith in the ancient oak rituals was a mark of resilience, an act of quiet rebellion against the cruel indifference of winter. Life went on amidst the small, meticulous preparations, knitting together a fragile hope that the old protections might still hold, even if just a little longer. There was something mildly ironic in the villagers' unwavering trust, given how often the stories were simple tales with hints of ornamental superstition, like whispering to trees or tossing coins at roots. Yet everyone played along with serious intent. Sometimes a neighbor would chuckle softly at the absurdity of expecting oak spirits to truly listen. But still, they joined in the annual rites, their faces blurry and unreadable like the prophets in distant paintings. The cold night air carried faint sounds of rustling leaves and murmured prayers, the community slowly participating in their shared routine, flawed but earnest. A few farmers, eyeing their frost-dulled orchards, wondered if the old folk tales were just that stories to pass the long, hard winter with a semblance of purpose and patience. And yet, that irony was perhaps the very thing that kept their spirits from freezing solid, buried beneath layers of tradition and doubt alike. Eventually, the first light snowfall softened the dark landscape into a quiet white blanket, and the villagers found a strange, calming rhythm in their shared ritual. The frost clung delicately to every branch and blade of grass. Yet, within the community's muted gatherings, there was a gentle sense of reassurance, an acceptance that, while winter's grip was cold and relentless, their simple acts filtered through generations offered a quiet shield. Marta, her face faintly illuminated by a candle's glow, watched her neighbors with a tired smile. Her role was only to remind, not to command. And perhaps that was enough for now. They sat close, hands steadfast on mugs of warm, weak herbal tea, listening to the faint whisper of the rustling oak somewhere unseen, as if breathlessly waiting for a sign. It was a soft reminder that protection was less in the power of rituals and more in the steady, humble act of believing together, even when the future remained uncertain. In the slow dawn of winter's deepening hush, the villagers reflected quietly on their traditions, realizing that perhaps the true comfort lay in the act of gathering itself, the ritual of sharing stories about invisible spirits, and keeping faith in shared, ordinary wonders. The oak, standing silent and sturdy, seemed to watch over them in a gentle, indifferent manner, its twisted branches reaching into the gray sky. The blurred faces of prophets and elders appeared now as mere shadows behind their eyelids, reminding them that some protections are rooted not in tangible magic, but in the quiet, unspoken trust that life persists amidst hardships. As they packed away the charred herbs and worn charms, they carried with them the subtle irony that human hope, perhaps especially in times of cold, resides less in certainty and more in the patience to believe regardless. And so, beneath the dull gray clouds, the village settled into another quiet winter, quietly waiting for the sun to return. On a quiet evening when the air outside hung heavy with frost, Marta gathered the villagers around the communal hearth, a place both literal and symbolic in their sparse community. The crackling flames cast a faint glow on tired faces, and as she carefully bound a bundle of fresh evergreen boughs and a humble spoonful of barley flour, she began to chant the familiar hearthfire oath. The words were soft, almost lost in the gentle hum of the wind seeping through the cracks. Yet they carried a weight of collective hope, an unspoken promise that warmth and sustenance would come to those who kept the fire alive and shared what little they had. No one dared to speak loudly. Tradition insisted silence was part of the sacred ritual, even as the bitter wind outside threatened their fragile refuge. The night stretched quietly forward, filled with small gestures and the silent reassurance that, somehow, their community might endure if they held fast to these modest rites. As the hours passed, a sudden gust of wind snuck through a tiny crevice, flickering the flames and casting erratic shadows across the faces of the gathered villagers. The fire sputtered briefly, almost as if it hesitated, an unwelcome reminder of the external hardships they faced. Marta's voice faltered slightly, but she continued, her tune a steady whisper that seemed to plead for the flames to stay brave. They all watched, eyes fixed on the flickering light, as if their collective will could coax the fire into lasting through the cold night. The wind's persistence seemed almost petty in its defiance, yet somehow fitting a small, constant challenge to their quiet ritual. Still, beneath the tension, there was a shared understanding. The fire burned not just for warmth, but as a fragile symbol of their mutual reliance and hope. In an almost paradoxical twist of human perseverance, the villagers began to chuckle softly at the absurdity of their earnest dedication. How such simple words and tiny gestures carried the weight of their survival. Marta, with her face blurred by the flickering light, finally allowed herself a faint smile, her voice carrying the slightly ironic tone of someone aware of human folly and resilience both. The wind continued its whisper outside, but inside, the fire found a moment's calm, just enough to breathe a little easier. The shared barley and evergreen, now though humble, symbolized something greater, a communal effort to survive the relentless winter. The ritual persisted, not because it guaranteed safety, but because it grounded them in their imperfect, enduring humanity. And so, the night moved on, quietly underscoring how fragile hope can be, and how surprising, sometimes, its quiet persistence truly is. As dawn tiptoed into the sky, the villagers began to stir, their faces touched with the faint light of the morning, and softened by a quiet, collective calm. The fire, now almost exhausted, but still flickering faintly, served as a reminder of their small victories and lingering fears. Marta's ritual was completed, another cycle of memory and tradition, quietly woven into the fabric of their lives, without grand gestures, simply familiar routines that offered a moment of dignity and continuity. The bitter wind outside had diminished, leaving behind a trace of stillness, as if the land itself had taken a breath in relief. People pulled on their worn cloaks and prepared to face another day, knowing well that their survival depended on such modest rituals, imperfect but persistent. In the muted glow of morning, there was a subtle understanding. Hope warms in small, unnoticed ways, much like the ember they kept alive, fragile but resilient. Looking back, the simple act of Marta's night-long ritual reveals a quiet truth about human endurance. Small acts of care, rituals, and shared stories form the silent backbone of community life, especially in seasons when everything feels precarious. The blurred faces of prophets or wise elders remain unseen, yet their influence lingers invisibly in these routines, shaping lives through tradition rather than dogma. The hearth fire, softly burning, embodies both necessity and poetry, the mundane act of keeping a flame alive, holding within it the weight of collective hope, surpassing even the bitterest wind. Perhaps this slow, deliberate act of swearing an oath around a humble fire encapsulates the way humans cling to stability amid chaos. By trusting in small, shared acts, quietly woven into the fabric of daily life. And so, as the land settled into a wary, muted dawn, the villagers carried on, each small step a reminder that perseverance often looks like patience, and hope meanders quietly forward. As winter's chill settled silently over the small hamlet, the villagers found solace in their routines, clinging to age-old superstitions that promised safety through simple rites and shared whispers. Tomas, a young shepherd with eyes that still held curiosity, listened vaguely to the stories of St. Bridget's distant shrine, where a single journey might bring protection against the relentless snow. Equipped with a faded cloak and a prayer carved into a piece of wood, he prepared to leave just as dawn's subdued light peeked through thatched roofs, feeling a strange mixture of hope and dull obligation. The quiet world around him seemed slower, each breath visible in the crisp air, as if the very landscape was exhaling in calm anticipation. Somewhere in the stillness, the idea that a blessing could halt the winter's advance felt both comforting and faintly absurd, like a whisper slipping through a forgotten keyhole. The road ahead was quiet, broken only by Tomas's footsteps crunching softly against the frozen ground, while shadows stretched long and indistinct behind him. As he moved deeper into the snowy woods, the wind carried faint howls, stirring memories of old stories about wolves prowling just beyond the verge of sight, beasts that symbolized both danger and doubt. Reaching the frozen river, Tomas paused, feeling the fragile crackle of ice beneath his feet, like a brittle promise waiting to break. He hesitated, weighing the urge to cross against the fear of plunging into the icy water below. Yet, with a steady breath, he pressed on, clutching the worn talisman, his mind flickering between faith in the saint and the creeping suspicion that some dangers couldn't be warded away by superstition alone. The trek grew heavier, more silent, as doubts seeped into the edges of his resolve. Midway through his journey, Tomas was met with an ironic sort of patience. Sheepishly, he saw a small flock of birds settle on a distant branch, unperturbed by the cold, as if mocking the human worry he carried. His thoughts drifted to the stories told by elder villagers about saints whose faces were hidden in the light, forever blurred in the stories retold around the hearth, never fully seen but deeply believed. As he looked toward the distant shrine, the snow started to fall slightly thicker, winding around him like a slow, indifferent shroud, and he wondered whether the power of his faith alone could pull him through. The wolves' distant howls grew softer, blending into the wind, an ironic lullaby that seemed almost unaware of his small, earnest pilgrimage. His steps forced into a rhythm, quiet and almost resigned, as the world kept turning in its unhurried, unblinking way. Reaching the edge of the woods, as evening crept closer, Tomas felt an unexpected calm settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the unpredictability of the world. On the outskirts of the shrine, a faint glow of dying light caught the blurred faces of saints in nearby chapels, figures too distant and shadowed to hold firm certainty, yet somehow reassuring in their anonymity. He slowed his steps, realizing that perhaps the true protection lay not in the saint's hidden face, but in the persistence of carrying faith as one carries a small, warm stone on a cold day. The snowflakes now drifted softly onto his shoulders, melting into the fabric of his cloak, as if acknowledging his quiet effort. There was a certain peace in knowing that some rituals might simply be pauses, moments where hope and doubt quietly coexist, neither fully wrong nor right. Back in the hamlet, Tomas's footsteps returned to familiar, if slightly weathered, routines. The journey now a quiet story remembered in passing glances and subtle smiles. The snow still fell softly outside windows, filling the quiet spaces with a faint hush, as villagers nodded over steaming mugs and shared small, knowing looks about the power of superstitions that had carried them through countless winters. In the end, perhaps it was less about divine intervention and more about the gentle rhythm of human persistence, believing in something beyond what could be seen, simply because the world felt too cold otherwise. The blurred faces of saints continued to watch silently from their shadowed niches, as Tomas, resting by the hearth, gently realized that some protections are held in faith, others in the worn quiet of routine. And in that stillness, everything seemed both fragile and enough. As dusk settled over the quiet village, Tomas made his way home through a landscape softened by the glow of fading sunlight. The air was cool and still, his footsteps muffled on the dirt path, the faint aroma of wood smoke lingering in his nostrils. Inside the humble cottages, families prepared for the long night, each tending to their simple rituals, lighting lanterns, stacking firewood, or murmuring quiet prayers. It was a time when the coming winter's hardships loomed like an unspoken truth. Yet life carried on with a calm, almost resigned patience, trusting in age-old customs to see them through. Tomas, like others, carried the reassuring weight of tradition, feeling the steady rhythm of human hope woven into the mundane fabric of everyday life. As midnight drew near, a subtle shift whispered through the village, an almost imperceptible tightening in the atmosphere, as if unseen threads pulled taut across the land. The elders gathered quietly at the village center, their faces blurred beneath the flickering light of oil lamps, leaning on each other's words and gestures. The air thickened with anticipation as they sprinkled coarse salt onto the ground, their hands slow and careful, like a ritual that had endured beyond memory. A faint chime from a distant bell mingled with murmured chants, while lanterns swung gently in the cold breeze, casting elongated shadows. It was here, amid these small acts, that the villagers placed their fragile faith, hoping the oak spirits listened and would grant them safe passage through winter's grasp. Suddenly, there was a moment of quiet absurdity, just as if the whole routine might be a little too predictable. The sky itself decided to intervene. A warm, swift rush of air seemed to ripple through the icy veil surrounding the village, causing the frost to shimmer and crackle like brittle glass. The traditional ringing of bells seemed to swell into a gentle tumult, drowning out the humble prayers and pep talks. The villagers, watching with mild bemusement, felt the unexpected thaw unfold, a small miracle born from what was, after all, a fragile hope dressed as superstition. The thin veil of winter's grip was shattered, dissolving as the land responded unexpectedly to their collective faith. It was a fleeting reminder that even in slow rituals, nature might choose to surprise them all. With the cold retreating, the village settled into a calm that was almost meditative. Lanterns flickered less feverishly, and the frost on the rooftops receded into quiet patches of dampness. Tomas, sitting on his bench, watched the last remnants of winter's grip melt away, feeling a wistful sense of peace, and understanding that these rituals, no matter how simple or uncertain, created moments where hope and doubt danced closely. The elders, their faces softened by the flickering light and the thaw, shared silent smiles, perhaps amused at the small irony of their efforts. It was as if, through their patience and persistence, they had gently coaxed the winter to yield, a mundane act imbued with quiet magic, reminding them that sometimes belief alone can shape reality just enough to keep life moving forward. As dawn approached, the village seemed to breathe a collective sigh, already settling into the slow rhythm of a new day. Tomas reflected on how these customs, linked perhaps more to tradition than reason, held the community together with their understated humor and humble faith. The blurred faces of the elders by the firelight, the soft hum of morning activity, and the lingering warmth of the thaw spoke quietly of human resilience, an imperfect dance with the unseen world. In the calm after the storm of superstition and surprise, there was a gentle acknowledgement that often life's small rituals sufficed to hold the restless spirit of winter at bay. The village, like history itself, moved on in its slow, steady way, ever hopeful, ever tentative, and quietly amused by its own enduring efforts. As winter's grip finally loosened, the land slowly awakened under a pale blue sky, its cold breath retreating, leaving behind softened earth and sleeping roots. Peasants, weary but hopeful, watched as tiny green shoots pierced through the thawed soil, a quiet testimony to perseverance. They exchanged faint smiles, recalling the long months of survival with a mix of relief and distant anticipation. Amidst flickering firelight, they tidied their tools and muttered quietly about the seasons to come, trusting in old customs to carry them through. The air felt still, yet full of a gentle promise that spring's renewal was finally at hand, and life would continue, quietly as always. Yet beneath the calm surface, many harbored cautious superstitions, clutching to charms and rituals learned across generations. Peasants sprinkled salt at the thresholds, whispering charms that no shadow of winter's hardship would return before planting began in earnest, sharing bread and barley. They marked the days with small offerings to the unseen, glimpsed faces of saints blurred by the rising sun, their features hidden yet watchful. The oak trees, symbols of strength, seemed to stand even taller, as if listening patiently. All the while, the distant echo of old songs and prayers filled the air, a reminder that their fragile hope was held together not just by earth and seed, but by stories and rituals that had weathered colder times. Irony lingered in how earnest their hopes felt alongside the quiet humor that seeped into their routines. How peasant families would joke about the wise winter, as if it were a stubborn guest who refused to leave. Despite all the charms and prayers, they chuckled softly at tales of misguided rituals, like offering a crooked sickle to appease the weather, knowing well enough that nature did not bargain or obey commands. The blurred faces of saints flashed briefly in the glow of firelight, as if amused by human efforts, ever unseen but mildly tolerant. Even in their most serious moments, there was a sense that life was a slow dance of hope and irony, conducted with patience and a faint smile. In these small acts and jokes, they found a kind of resilience born from knowing how little control they truly had. As the days grew longer and the first warmth touched the land, a calm settled over the fields and villages. Peasants moved amid their work with quiet purpose, feeling the earth's gentle heat beneath the softened soil. The rituals persisted, blowing on the budding plants for luck, whispering blessings to unseen guardians, and their voices softened in reverence, almost absent-minded, as if the land itself was whispering back. Their faces, now less strained and more relaxed, carried signs of awakening, eyes brighter, shoulders less burdened. The oak leaves stirred above, rustling softly, and somewhere in the distance, the faint toll of bells heralded the coming of a new season. The air was thick with a slow, peaceful anticipation, as if patience had finally yielded a modest reward. Standing amidst the early green shoots and warming breeze, the peasants gathered for a humble harvest festival, an unassuming celebration of persistence and renewal. They shared simple foods, passing bread and ale, in a ritual that felt more about continuity than fervor. Faces soft with fatigue and quiet hope watched children chase each other across blossoming fields, their laughter mingling with the whispers of the leaves. The stories of saints and oak trees, once told with shyness or skepticism, now settled into prouder tradition, etched into the rhythm of the year. In this gentle moment of gratitude, there was a quiet acknowledgement that life's hardships were neither conquered nor ignored. They merely moved with the seasons, patiently awaiting the next. And so, The old lore persisted, a slow, steady reminder that hope and humility were enough to carry them through yet another cycle. As dawn approached, the family slowly found warmth in the shared memories of better days and in the quiet resilience that survival required. The fire was rekindled with cautious strokes, enough to stave off despair and quickly restore a fragile comfort. Outside, the ice on the river reflected a muted gray morning, and the thick silence of winter pressed softly against the windows. Their day unfolded slowly, fetching water, checking supplies, and listening to the faint sounds of neighbors doing the same. A shared cup of cold broth became a small act of hope, a reminder that even in stillness, life persisted quietly. The season's harshness had woven itself into their daily routine, a slow lesson in patience and humility. But soon, a real concern crept in as more firewood had to be gathered, and the supply began to dwindle unexpectedly. The villagers hurriedly searched the woods, rustling dry leaves and snapping brittle branches, all while Myra frowned with a faint, tired humor. Faced with the shortage, they improvised, trying to burn peat and birch bark instead of seasoned hardwood, their fires sputtering and flickering with uncertain strength. The relentless gray sky seemed to watch their efforts with detached indifference, and questions arose about whether the meager provisions could hold out. The air thickened with smoke and uncertainty, and the quiet hum of worry grew just enough to disturb the peaceful rhythm they once relied on. Sitting quietly in the fading dusk, the villagers reflect on their modest harvests, smiles lingering as if acknowledging a collective, imperfect achievement. Their stories of smoke, fermentation, and grain are woven into the fabric of their daily existence, unnoticed by the wider world, but deeply felt. They have learned the gentle art of patience, knowing that survival often depends on these small, unnoticed acts of care. As shadows deepen and the earth grows colder once more, there is a quiet thankfulness, an unspoken recognition that, despite everything, they have managed to endure yet another season, with nothing more than their own humble ingenuity and a shared, unpretentious hope. In these quiet moments, the memory of their labor feels both fleeting and quietly eternal. As dusk settled over the village, the communal hall gradually filled with neighbors seeking warmth and solace. The blazing hearth cast flickering shadows on tired faces, each person reaching for their spot near the fire, as if the warmth could somehow chase away the chill that had seeped into bones overnight. It was a quiet acknowledgement that survival depended on shared space and silent cooperation, a ritual reinforced in the slow, steady rhythm of daily life. The children's soft murmurs mixed with the crackle of wood and the low hum of adult conversations, all under the watch of unseen, blurred figures that once might have been prophets or elders, now distant in shadow and light. Here, amid simple stones and thick wool cloaks, the village began to forge more than just warmth. They forged a quiet, stubborn hope for the night ahead. Then came the noise, an ominous roar of wind that grew into a howling storm, the sky darkening swiftly as snow began to whip across rooftops and streets. The villagers hurried to secure fragile thatched roofs and close shutters, their layered clothing now a silent testament to winter's persistence. Not enough to stave off the fury outside. Tomas's coat and Mara's fur cloak, thick and well-constructed, became vital. They braved the rising storm to move between homes, bracing against the wind to pull neighbors from snowdrifts and dashed shutters that threatened to give way. Every gust shook the walls, and the storm's ferocity underscored how fragile their simple garments and insulated layers truly were. The village, once a calm collection of modest dwellings, had transformed into a maze of survival, an uncertain dance with forces too immense to fight head-on.